Joining us, our very good friend Stephen Yates, and you can find him on X at Yates Comms. And of course, he is the chair of the China Policy Initiative with the America First Policy Institute. Stephen, always a pleasure to have you. What is happening over there? I mean, everything I read about it, I mean, when you try to figure out if that's what is some states are dealing with, like they had an outbreak of pneumonia, and I mean, it's a respiratory system, and apparently it affects kids. So is this like a bat virus playing in caves, biowarfare 2.0? What is it?
Well, there is a heavy dose of deja vu all over again
Mm-hmm.
with this story. And, with regard to whatever the so called experts of the last go around want to say this time around, there are some really strong parallels in the sense that it's obvious that something bad is happening inside China. And even in a controlled media environment, there is video and text commentary coming out that's undeniable that there's a health problem. Then you also see the revival of the old means for dealing with it. So the COVID regime is coming back in terms of masking up and isolations and other kinds of things. And so you'd think that would be enough. We should have learned if we would have had a travel ban on movement out of China, say in December of 2019, when we first got reports of this kind of stuff and had visual evidence of it out of China, we might have saved 1 million lives and $1 trillion or more in our economy and a whole host of other things. And so what's the argument now? Are we right back there where when President Trump did in late January put a travel ban in place, he was called xenophobic by then opportunistic candidate, soon to be President Joe Biden, and then House Speaker Nancy Pelosi? But really, that's where we are. We have plenty of evidence to justify no one should be coming and going to China without some kind of testing or quarantining at this point.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And this, I mean, it's. I feel like we're at the moment where anytime we have outbreaks like this, especially if China is dealing with it at least first or earlier than we are, we're always now going to go, is this biowarfare? Is this another
Yeah.
attempt to shut down the planet again? I mean, I don't think that that's us being unreasonable. I mean, we kind of went through it the last time.
No, absolutely right. The burden is on them. They're the ones that created this witch's brew. They're the ones that deliberately let it out into the world. They're the ones that lied in capital letters to everyone and manipulated a very easily manipulated UN system that we stupidly followed too closely the last time. The things that are very different now is I think that a large swath of Americans and others around the world aren't going to buy this a second time around. We know that there are going to be health consequences, but there were health and other consequences to following their hokum last time. And so I don't think that the prescriptions they put forward, which have a heavy dose of political control that come with them, coincidentally in an election year again, are going to be swallowed. And it's not just the crazy lunatic fringe that Joe Biden wants to talk about. There's a lot of independents and even some Democrats that have had it. I have some friends that work in inner cities among minority populations. They're pretty sick and tired of this stuff going on. And I just, really at this point, why is anyone coming and going and dealing with China as if it's normal? And I don't think any significant population in the United States is ready to say, oh, well, let's mask up and social distance shut down again. Heck no.
Yeah, and it's weird too that it only seems to really affect teenagers and kids. I mean, it's a very different. Well, we'll keep an eye on it, but it's a very different thing.
Well, if you have a government that doesn't care about human beings and has no ethics or accountability, you can conduct experiments that target only a certain kind of people or only a certain age group or only a certain religious preference. They may or may not have been doing this in their own country, and now they may or may not be exporting it into the world. We found this weird facility out in California. Maybe the good governor there who got a little horse kick this last week could go look on what happened with this biolab that was in California. But we've got all kinds of warning flags about this stuff from China, and it's not staying there.
Yeah, that's a great point. Talking with our good friend Stephen Yates, that's a very good point. China is claiming that a U.S. warship violated its national sovereignty. This comes from The Hill. They've accused this Navy ship of violating their sovereignty. It was the USS Gabrielle Giffords that appeared in the Second Thomas Shoal. This is some reef in the South Seas. It's a reef in the South Seas. They said that it violated that it can, now correct me if I'm wrong, but the only way that their sovereignty is violated is if you believe that the South Sea is theirs and not international
Yeah.
waters.
Well, I am so sorry that the tender feelings of Winnie the Pooh are really hurt if you come a couple thousand miles within his territory. But if that's the way they want to go, I mean, I hope that the neighbors and others around the world are wising up. You know, on the one hand, China can't be this 10-foot tall thing that's too hard to tackle and maybe treat as a peer, like saying, I'm not going to let you step on my lawn without pushing you back. Or they're so sensitive that you can't come within a couple thousand miles of their territory. I mean, I am so sorry that you are hurt, Mr. Insulated Autocrat. But my goodness, it's just one of those things where it kind of makes your head hurt that it makes headlines, but it's a perfect indication of how bad establishment policy has been on China. And it's not just in the United States that this is even a question. I mean, we're much closer to other countries' waters than to China's. And this claim of this whole area going down into Southeast Asia is redonkulous.
Yeah. And the only way, because it seems like they would love to use something like that as a pretext for increased hostilities, but also the only way that they would be able to achieve that is if other nations beyond their own recognized and said, oh yes, that is those international waters so far away from you and actually closer to everyone else, yes, that's still your territory. They would have to validate that in order for that to work, right?
They would, but one of the scarier things about the time we live in and what's been happening in the world, if you just look at the wave of demonstrations that have been whipped up against Israel, I mean, in a way, it's mind-breaking to me that Israel could be losing a PR battle. So many people assumed that alliance with the United States is so strong that never again really meant never again. And there has been a major information war waged against them that I think they have to feel like they're on their back heels at this point with regard to that information warfare. And if it's been tough on something that came straight out of terrorism, you got to think the CCP is wound up and ready to wage that kind of war too. And instead of flooding European capitals, they'll flood Asian capitals with nationalists and those flags and try to give people second thoughts about which side they want to come down on in this. So, I mean, we really have a lot of work to do to help people feel psychologically, politically, and sort of otherwise insulated from this information war that's coming. Right now, it's this silly provocation at sea, but it'll hit their streets in a snap if they really want to push the accelerator on it.
Yeah, you made a really good point with the propaganda war as it related to Israel. And I wanted to ask you this because we played the soundbite earlier. Kamala Harris, vice president, saying that they need to revitalize the quote unquote Palestinian Authority. To me, that demonstrates a huge ignorance of what really shapes and governs that region, because Hamas controls Gaza. They won elections there. They're so popular. The authorities suspended elections because they were worried that Hamas would also basically take over, and more than just behind the scenes, West Bank as well. They're still supremely popular. It's not, I mean, people chose them mainly because they didn't recognize the right of their neighbor to the north to exist. So what does she even mean there? You can't revitalize something that the people reject. Wouldn't that be the word that they always say, colonization?
Yeah, well, there are several problems with what our distinguished vice president seems to think and say, in that some of it is internal overseas, but some of it is grand scheme of things. We have a treaty alliance with Israel, and Israel was attacked by a terrorist group. No one that is a faithful ally should be saying or doing anything to interfere with that sovereign government's right to defend themselves against external terrorist forces brought in, armed, and murdering, raping, and et cetera, et cetera. And so I don't understand where the vice president thinks she's going to do anything to influence the world in a positive direction if the United States is in the business of immediately undermining an alliance under attack. But really, inside what she calls the Palestinian Authority, I mean, if this was a legitimate body accomplishing legitimate things, they wouldn't have harbored Hamas. There wouldn't have been this attack. And so this revitalizing of a failed institution that is not keeping peace with its neighbors, to the extent that it's not just the Israelis that they want to bloody up, but the Egyptians that won't take people out of that territory. And you've got to believe that if the Biden administration, if the president himself were to call the leader of Egypt, that something could be worked out. But it hasn't bothered him to make time for that. So it would seem to me the vice president isn't even on the same song sheet with the president. There's more than a few problems with the whole situation, but it begins with her not really even knowing the basics.
What a mess. What a mess. Our good friend Stephen Yates at YatesComms on X. I keep wanting to say Twitter, on X. Always such a pleasure. So respect your expertise and so good to see you, my friend. Thank you. Have a great week.
Thank you, Dana. Take care.
You too.